From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. You're listening to Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. This is the time when we get you up to date on the news that made headlines this last week. So we will be talking quite a bit about elections. Today, our panel includes Mia Maldonado, Clark Corbin, and Kyle Fonensteel with the Idaho Capital Sun, as well as Andrea Olson with EastIdahoNews.com. Happy Friday, everybody.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
As I said, we are 3 days post-election. So what do all of these results mean for Idaho? I want to start with voter turnout first and foremost, because Kyle, it looks like Idaho may have broken some records. Can you fill us in?
Yeah, so right now it's clear that Idaho set a new voter turnout record for the number of ballots cast. Almost 917,000 Idahoans voted in Tuesday's election. Idaho election officials expected us to break that record, but whether we set another new record for the percent of voters that turned out wasn't immediately clear. This year, initial estimates say that about 85.7% of Idaho registered voters participated in the elections. Officials say they still have some numbers to crunch on that. But still, this year is up there for one of the highest voter turnout rates for presidential elections. Voters tend to turn out for those more. That we turn out at an average rate of 76% in Idaho's history over the past century. The voter turnout records were last broken in 2020, both for turnout rate and for the number of ballots cast. And there's one other interesting voter record we broke this year. For the first time, more voters cast in-person early votes than mail-in absentee votes. That's led local election officials to consider expanding early voting options down the road.
Well, and that would make sense, right, Clark? Right, Kyle? Because I know just anecdotally, people kept telling me how long the lines were for early voting. But when I cast my ballot on election day, not a line at all.
I heard the same thing too. I didn't see it. I voted absentee this year, but what the numbers show that about 218,000 Idahoans cast early votes, while around 173,000 cast absentee ballots.
So with that said, Clark, turnout was, as Kyle said, I mean, potentially record breaking. And not only presidential election was on the line, but every Idaho legislative race was up for grabs on Tuesday. So can you break down what this means for the balance of power in the Idaho legislature as we head into the 2025 session? I mean, yes, there is a Republican supermajority in the state of Idaho, but they expanded that.
Yeah, Gemma, thanks so much. I'm glad we get to kind of break down the election results on the show today. So thanks for the time and happy to join the panel today. But you're exactly right. The Republican supermajority and the Idaho legislature is going to expand. It's going to expand by 3 seats overall. And so the overall balance of power, starting with the 2025 legislative session, there's 105 total seats in the legislature. Like you said, all of them were up for elections this year, and the Republican Party picked up 3 seats. So the balance of power is going to be 90 Republicans to 15 Democrats when the legislature gets back to town. And so the reason that happened is 3 incumbent Democrat legislators lost on Tuesday, and actually on Wednesday we learned it when they finished counting all the ballots in Blaine County and Canyon County. But 3 incumbent Democrats lost. That's Senator Rick Just, a Democrat from Boise, Republican Ned Burns, a Democrat from Bellevue, and Representative Nate Roberts, a Democrat from Pocatello. They were all 3 defeated by Republican challengers. And so the influence and the ability to sort of counteract extremism from fringes of the Republican Party is going to be diminished. There's going to be fewer Democrats, and we don't know yet, but it could wind up with Democrats actually losing seats on some of the key committees in the Idaho legislature, maybe the House Education Committee, maybe the House Health and Welfare Committee, maybe JFAC. Those will all be decided in December, and we can talk about that a little bit later in today's segment. But the Republican supermajority's been enhanced by 3 seats, and Republicans have had a majority overall in the Idaho legislature since 1961. And so it continues to grow as part of the, people are calling it a red wave that we saw this week in the general election. But yeah, that's going to set up a lot of interesting dynamics and potential changes for that upcoming legislative session that we'll all be following closely, Gemma.
So, Clark, let's dive into what this does mean for legislative leadership and committee assignments. You mentioned that just a second ago, but because this is decided next month, correct? So, let's start with this, Clark. For folks who maybe don't pay as much attention to the legislature as we do, break down what legislative leadership is, what these committees, are, and frankly, when you only have 15 Democrats, they're going to be spread really thin, let alone probably being able to be on every committee.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. And so we can kind of, get into it. But legislative leadership, the House Republicans and House Democrats and Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats, they all kind of break into their own little teams. They're called caucuses, but they're each going to have their leadership officers that they elect. And those are people that make decisions, that kind of lead the party, that kind of lead the action when the legislative session gets going. They have influence over what bills get heard and called to the floor and advanced. And so these are, positions you may have heard, like Speaker of the House or Senate President Pro Tem. Those are all leadership positions. And so that's what we're talking about. And Republicans and Democrats both have leadership positions. But as we talked about with the Republican supermajority, the real power is with the Republican leadership officers. Those will take place in private, behind closed doors, on the first Wednesday in December. And a couple of interesting races really to watch, particularly when we talk about Senate Republican leadership, Gemma. Senate President Pro Tem Chuck Winder, a Republican from Boise, the longtime Senate President Pro Tem, was defeated in the primary elections this year. And so there's an opening for the top leadership spot on the Republican Senate team there. That's going to be very closely watched, and that's a very influential position. And then also the assistant majority leader position within the Republican Party in the Idaho Senate is also up for grabs, Gemma, because former Senator Abby Lee chose not to run for re-election and then resigned in July to take another job. And so two key Republican Senate leadership races at least to be decided the first week of Wednesday, and that will or the first Wednesday in December, and that will kind of give way to, once those are decided, then we'll pick the committee chairpersons, and these are the people that preside over the legislative committees, and the committees are kind of where the action starts during the legislative session. The bills are introduced and public hearings are held in committees, and so a committee chair has a lot of influence. And so again, that first week of December, once the leadership teams are announced, then the leadership teams will pick the committee chairs who have a lot of influence, and then each and every legislator will get committee assignments, different committees that they will serve on. And so it's a little bit wonky, it's a little bit insidery, but the important thing to know is that there's power up for grabs. Some of these will be contested. And then once we do learn the results, this will go a long way to shaping kind of the debates and the conversations that we do have during the legislative session. It'll go a long way to influencing the bills that are introduced, the bills that are advanced, maybe the bills that are held up. One dynamic that we've seen in recent years has been sometimes the Idaho Senate has been reluctant to take up some legislation that's been passed by the Idaho House. They kind of served as a backstop or a firewall or defense of some sort. And so with Senate leadership elections up for grabs, it'll be interesting to see if that dynamic continues. But really, we're talking about power and influence and who has it. And so we just had the election where the people voted, and now the legislators themselves will vote on getting organized in early December there, Gemma.
And Mia, another thing let's discuss is the fact that legislators can now expect to see raises, I believe, come January. Now, explain this to us, because there's a committee that looks at legislative salaries and they decided on this pay increase. So can we start there on who this committee is and what they do?
Yeah, of course, Gemma. So, according to the Idaho Constitution, the legislature has no authority to establish their pay, but rather there is a citizens committee that consists of 6 members who are not publicly elected officials. 3 of them are appointed by the governor, and 3 of them by the Idaho Supreme Court. So, on Wednesday morning, the day after the election, the Citizens Committee on Legislative Compensation, they approved an increase in salaries for state legislators. State legislators, they're considered part-time workers. So currently they were making $19,913 for their role. And then they also get costs for daily meals and travel expenses covered as a part of their role. And so the Citizens Committee approved a raise to $25,000 per year. And then we'll see Senate and House leadership also receive a slight additional increase, in addition to minority leadership getting a little bit of an increase for their leadership role. So this change is not what the original legislative leadership proposed. Originally, state leadership, including Senate Pro Tem Chuck Winder, proposed a 43% increase in raises, and he defended this increase at the hearing Wednesday, saying, the cost of housing in Boise is really expensive, and we have legislators that live in hotels in downtown Boise, and that cost them from $200 to $300 a night. So he really advocated for this 43% increase, and that would have boosted salaries to $37,000, but ultimately, the Citizens Committee did not approve that proposal and went with an increase to $25,000. A little update on this, though, is on Friday, a group of conservative legislators, including Senator Glenetta Zuderveld, a Republican in Twin Falls, she announced that she would stand against the proposed salary increase. So, as I mentioned earlier, the legislature has no role in establishing their salaries, but they can reject or reduce the new rates, and they have to do so by a concurrent resolution. So Senator Zuderveld announced that she, along with some other conservative legislators, will propose a concurrent resolution on the first day of the legislative session to reject the proposed salary increases. And their reason is because they would rather focus their efforts on repealing the grocery tax. So that's something that we can look forward to in the legislative session.
So, Mia, if I'm understanding this correctly, if these legislators say we don't want this, does it have to be so does that mean it won't go into effect? I mean, does the decision by legislators to either accept the increase or not have to be unanimous for it to move forward?
Right. I'm not sure about if it has to be unanimous, but yeah, they can't really raise it, but it's just a matter of whether or not enough people will vote to reject this proposal. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
I appreciate that clarification on that. Andrea, before we go to break, talk to us about what happened on Election Day in Madison County, in particular with BYU Idaho students, because your organization did some reporting that hundreds of BYU Idaho students were turned away at the polls Tuesday. So what happened?
That's right. It was due to a law that passed last year in the Idaho legislature. So Idaho legislators passed House Bill 340 and House Bill 124 last year in 2023. And it went into effect in January. So what this law does, it requires voters to present an Idaho driver's license, passport, weapons permit, tribal ID, or a federal photo ID at the polls. But it removed student IDs as a valid form of identification at the polls, which a lot of students were used to doing, is bring their photo ID, their student ID. But before the law change, voters could also register to vote with an out-of-state driver's license along with proof of local residency. So I know a lot of students were upset about that, and they make a large percentage of Rexburg's population. There's over 24,000 students there that are currently enrolled on campus, according to, Brigham Young University, Idaho officials. And so many of them came to the polls and felt blindsided. Some of them, this was the first time they've ever voted, and they tried to do their research and thought they could bring their student ID when that just couldn't happen. So some of them were pretty bummed out by that. And the Madison County clerk said that they have tried to spread the word about the new requirements. They have been on the BYU Idaho campus, and they've attended several events with booths that explain this new law. So yeah, a lot of people just were turned away. And the Madison County clerk, her name's Kim Muir, she also pointed out that those without an Idaho driver's license could have requested an absentee ballot from their home state. But some of the things also slipped through the cracks. It was interesting because one of our reporters talked to a voter who did present a Utah driver's license and her housing lease, and she was suddenly allowed to vote when she wasn't really supposed to. And the clerk said that shouldn't have happened, but they had 160 poll workers working for them, and they spent a whole week training them, going over every item like this. So they work long hours, and they're trained very well, but sometimes mistakes are made. So I found that really interesting, but that's mainly the reason why so many were turned away because of this new law.
Well, I appreciate that update, and hopefully that information spreads for the next election cycle. Kyle, you've got some information in regards to Ada County and that. So can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so I heard similar things were happening in Ada County. The clerk, Trent Tipple, told me and the Idaho Statesman that some voters had trouble registering under the new laws on election day and that some voters were disenfranchised. On one day, he said he had to regretfully turn away around a dozen potential voters. And he said he heard similar things from other Ada County election workers on other days. When I talked to Idaho Secretary of State Phil McGrain, he said he wasn't sure the scope of the problem since his office doesn't track that data, but he was somewhat skeptical. He said he didn't really see a significant swing in election day voter registration since the new law passed, and the data on same day registration backs that up too.
Okay, well, appreciate that update on that. Clark, let's talk Proposition 1. This would have opened Idaho's primary elections as well as put in place ranked choice voting. Not only did this proposition fail Tuesday, Clark, it failed significantly. So can you break down this failure for us and also what we've learned in regards to that vote itself?
Yeah, for sure, Gemma. And that was probably the thing that surprised me the most of this entire election was the result of Proposition 1, not only going down, but the margin of defeat. This is something that would have required a simple majority to pass, so just 50% plus one. But what ended up happening is voters rejected it almost 70% to 30%. And so the message was not only no, but heck no. And so that was maybe the thing that surprised me about it the most. And then there's some cool new tools to analyze the vote and the results that are available through the voteidaho.gov website that the Secretary of State's office has put out. And so I was kind of playing around with some of the results and some of the maps, especially once all the ballots were counted fully by late Wednesday afternoon. And Proposition 1 ended up failing in 43 of Idaho's 44 counties, Jim. Blaine County was the only county where it did pass. And so I thought that was the most interesting result on election day. I think that that surprised me the most. And as you said, it would have made changes to both the primary election and the general election. It would have repealed the closed primary election law that makes it so that if voters are not formally affiliated with a political party, that political party doesn't have to allow them to vote in their primary election. It also would have brought what's called ranked choice voting, or sometimes called an instant runoff system to the general election. It would have had those two different components. But with the failure of Proposition 1, it's important to point out that there is no change made to Idaho election laws at this point. And so nothing is going to change in the next election or 2 years from now unless the legislature makes changes or unless a group brings forward another ballot initiative. But that's a whole lengthy process. And so our elections won't be changed. They'll stay exactly how they are, and voters don't need to do anything. They don't need to update their voter registration or anything like that unless they move or unless they would normally need to update it. So everything's going to stay the same. But yeah, looking across the state, it failed in 43 of 44 counties, Blaine County being the only exception. And yeah, the 70-30 margin roughly across the state was pretty decisive, Gemma, and that's what jumped out to me. And also want to give a shout out to our mutual friend Kevin Richard, a friend of the Idaho Matters show, who's done a lot of great reporting and talking about election analysis as well, and definitely worth checking out the work that he does and their team does over at Idaho Ed News. But that stood out to me, Gemma.
Well, and I tell you, Clark, a couple of things that stood out to me as well was that nationwide ranked choice voting failed. There were a handful of states that had this on the ballot and it failed. And in fact, Alaska repealed its ranked choice voting. But also,
that's a good point.
Yeah. And then the other thing too, Clark, I mean, it's that 43 counties rejected this, because I think what stood out to me was that I think there is a perception that something like this would pass in Ada County at least, right? That would be the outlier. And I'm curious about, and we could talk about this all day long, but what does that mean, with the electorate in Ada County, right? Because you would think historically something like this would pass.
Yeah, and it actually, just to go through the numbers on Ada County, it actually failed about 59 to 41 was about the margin in Ada County. So not as decisive as across the whole state, but it did not pass, and it wasn't all that close to passing in Ada County. I think for it to have had success and have had a chance to pass statewide, it would have had to do much better in Ada County and then have more support in areas besides just Blaine County. I think that, getting into the armchair quarterbacking a little bit, I think that some people are really wondering whether it was combining the open primary portion of the ballot initiative with the ranked choice voting component of the initiative. I've had a couple of conversations along those lines. I've had readers reach out to me. And I also remember a Boise State public policy survey from over a year ago before the election that talked about how Idahoans were not comfortable or were opposed to the idea of ranked choice voting, certainly in the political campaigns and a lot of the campaign materials I got. A lot of the vote no and the opposition, to the extent that it was focused on the policy, was really zeroed in on opposing the ranked choice voting component of it. So I don't know, had it been separate, or if in the future, if another group brings something that's narrowly focused on the primary, if that would have a different outcome or not. But that's one of the things that I'm been looking at and trying to dig into. And certainly I've had readers and other reporters reach out to me and wonder if combining the two played a role in the margin of defeat being as large as it was. But that was the issue that was brought forward to voters. It was one package, take it or leave it. And so we don't have the benefit of knowing how a separate proposal would have fared. But yeah, that was interesting. And you're right, Jim. It would have had to do well in Ada County to really have had a mathematical chance to do well and to pass across the state. And that didn't happen this week.
And then on the flip side, Kyle, the constitutional amendment that was on the ballot did pass by quite a large margin. So remind us about this amendment.
So that amendment was to explicitly ban non-citizens from voting in Idaho's elections. I think one key issue in this ballot measure was disagreement on whether it was even needed. Already, the Idaho Constitution requires U.S. citizenship for people to be able to vote, but amendment supporters said that the Constitution doesn't specifically exclude non-citizens, so this amendment would make that clear. That's partly to stop Idaho local governments from potentially allowing non-citizens to vote locally, which isn't happening and hasn't been attempted. A handful of local governments across the U.S. have allowed that, but none let non-citizens vote in statewide elections. Another key concern I heard from Democrats in the Idaho legislature is that the amendment was written so broadly that it could be interpreted to block non-citizens from voting in private elections, like for homeowner associations and parent-teacher associations. The amendment sponsor says that won't happen, and he didn't intend it to happen. But the amendment only required a simple majority of voters to pass. That's after 2/3 of the legislature approved it this spring, and unofficial results show nearly 65% of Idaho voters supported it.
Mm-hmm. So, Kyle, that breakdown of the vote, as you said, talk to us about that, because it passed overwhelmingly across the state.
Yeah, I don't know how specific counties voted for it, but it did pass overwhelmingly, and it only needed a simple majority to pass.
Mm-hmm.
I think we'll probably get clarity in the coming months or year about whether some of these concerns about private elections actually hold true. But
Yeah.
I think that's all in store.
So, Mia, let's get off of elections for a moment and talk about the fact that the Idaho Supreme Court heard arguments earlier this week on whether the judgment of a former Idaho legislator's conviction should be vacated. So, for folks who may not remember or may not know about this case, can you remind us, first off, who Aaron von Ellinger is and then what he was convicted of?
Yes, of course. So Aaron von Ellinger, he is a former House of Representative in Idaho, a Republican that was based in Lewiston. And in 2022, he was convicted of raping a former legislative intern by an Ada County jury. And he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, 8 of those fixed. And so immediately after his sentencing, within a month, he appealed his case to the Idaho Supreme Court. And so just this week, the Supreme Court heard arguments from his lawyer and the state as to why this case should be vacated. So his attorney, the main argument behind his attorney and behind his reasoning for appealing his case was because the prosecution at the time relied heavily on the testimony from a nurse who helped the victim. Going back to what the Idaho Capitol Sun has previously reported, so whenever Jane Doe, the victim, was set to testify, she gave really limited testimony and left the courtroom after saying she couldn't do this. So her testimony was stricken for consideration for the jury to consider. And so the prosecution relied on the nurse that helped her 2 days after the incident. And so von Ellinger's attorney is arguing that, they didn't get the chance to cross-examine the victim, and rather they relied so much on the nurse that helped the victim. So that's essentially the main argument behind the appeal. And the state at the Idaho Supreme Court hearing argued that, at the time, the von Ellinger's attorneys at trial, they didn't, request a mistrial or object to the nurse's testimony at the moment. So they were arguing against the appeal. And right now that appeal is under advisement. So the Idaho Supreme Court right now is just taking that into consideration, and they'll have a decision at a later time.
Okay, so at this point, we don't know when they may have a decision, as you said.
Correct.
Okay, appreciate that update on that. So, Clark, now that the election is over, it is time to gear up for Idaho's 2025 legislative session. And I know you touched on this earlier in the program today, but I want to walk through what that looks like and how it works, because lawmakers actually meet in a few weeks, even though the session doesn't begin until January. So let's start with when they meet and why they meet next month.
Yeah, for sure. And these are all the things that we're about to talk about are the things that are in Idaho state law and the Idaho Constitution to take us from getting the election results to gearing up for the legislative session that you said gets going in January. And so this process that we're about to go through happens every 2 years following a general election. And so it's actually going to start on December 2nd. All of this is going to be taking place in and around the Idaho State Capitol in Boise. But starting on December 2nd, there's going to be a new legislator orientation program for 3 days at the Capitol. And that's going to be for the 18 brand new fresh-faced rookie legislators that were elected for the first time this week. They're going to go over things like public records laws, how a bill becomes a law, how to draft a bill, legislative procedures, and kind of things of that nature. So that's going to go on starting December 2nd. We touched on this in the first segment today, but then on the evening of December, I want to say December 4th, which is a Wednesday night, there's going to be those leadership elections. And that's where the Republicans and Democrats from the House and Senate break into their own separate caucus teams and elect their leadership members, people like the Senate President Pro Tem, and on down the line. And those are the folks that really have a lot of influence in shaping the debate that's going to take place during the legislative session, shaping who plays a role on what committees, shaping what bills get introduced and what bills get called to the floor. That's going to happen on Wednesday, December 4th. And then on December 5th and 6th is really the official organizational session. That's when we expect all of the legislators, not just the new ones, not just leadership, but all of the legislators to be in Boise and to get those important committee assignments. Committees are kind of the grunt work where bills are introduced, public hearings are held. And so we're really going to have a sense of who's going to play what role, and that's going to be ironed out in early December. So come early January, those roles are all established, and we hit the ground running when the official 2025 legislative session kicks off on January 6th with Governor Brad Little's State of the State address. And then from there, the session is off and running. And so that first week of December, we're really going to see the statutory things that need to take place to get organized, to take us from the new election results to getting people sworn in to figuring out what roles everybody is going to play. It's a little bit of a slow process for an outsider to observe, but it's very important because it's all about power and influence and who holds it, Gemma. And we do expect, as we talked about in the first segment, that there are going to be two major changes to the Republican Senate leadership team. And so we'll watch out for that and watch and see if that changes any of the dynamics within the legislature there, Gemma.
So Clark, talk to us too about the fact that there's one thing that the Idaho legislature must do. This is in our Constitution, and people, may not know this, but the one thing they must do is set a budget, and they cannot adjourn any year until this is done. So haven't they also decided? I mean, kind of, they've set a date as to when they adjourn. I think it's a lofty goal on the date they've set.
Yeah, March 21st, 75 days into session is the goal for when they hope to adjourn. They just signed off on that calendar yesterday, and it's a non-binding goal. And I think you're right. It might be a little ambitious, especially if you consider that we're going to have new legislative leaders, 18 new legislators and new committee chairs. But you're absolutely right. The one requirement for them in the Idaho Constitution is to not just pass a budget, but pass a balanced budget. And what that means is we can't have our expenses exceed our revenue. And so that really gets going on day 2. And the budget process is really, Gemma, what drives the legislative session. It's the funding for each and every state agency, new programs that are introduced that require funding that has to get approved. We talk about JFAC, that's the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee. That's a powerful joint budget committee that meets every day in session and sets each element of the state budget for more than 100 different state agencies and state departments. It's the most intense part of the legislative session, and we see the bills flying left and right, and we see all those different kind of proposals, but it really is the budget process that is the reason the Idaho legislature meets every year, and one of their only constitutional obligations, like you pointed out, Gemma, is to pass that balanced budget. And so that's something that I know that we'll be watching closely, and that we'd be happy to come back and share about that budget process on the show once the session gets going in January there.
Yeah, absolutely. And one other thing, Clark, with that is how do you think the makeup of JFAC will change based on kind of this extra super majority of Republicans in the State House this session?
It's already a committee, JFAC's that joint budget committee. It's already a committee that's dominated by Republicans. I think there's members of the House and Senate on that committee. So that makes it a special committee. Right now, I think there are only 3 of the 20 seats held by Democrats, and only one of them is a House member. 2 years ago, when the Republicans picked up seats in the general election, they removed one of the Democrats from the budget committee. It'll be interesting to see if that happens again. But the math is going to get tricky when we have fewer Democratic legislators. The number of committees stays the same. I think there's something like 14 different committees in the House. Several of them meet at the same time, and there are only going to be 9 Democrats in the House. And so the math can get tough. I know they're going to want to have representation on every committee, but whether or not they have multiple members on every committee, I think is something that's going to be ironed out. So Democrats may lose committee representation, whether it's on an important policy committee like the Education Committee or the Health and Welfare Committee, or whether it's on JFAC and they go down from 3 Democrats to 2, remains to be seen. But I do expect some changes in some of those closely watched committees that deal with things like the budget, education, health and welfare, maybe even state affairs.
And then from there, it is what we'll be watching this upcoming session, right? And how all of that plays out. So I know you and your team, Clark, will all be there the entire session, and we will, of course, have you on to break everything down for us as you gear up for the next big push now that elections are over.
Yeah, it's along with elections, it's one of the biggest times of the year for us. And you're exactly right. We're excited that Kyle, Mia, and I will all be covering the legislative session full time, based out of the Capitol this year. Really trying to give folks an idea of what our legislators are up to, what they're working on, and how the budget is coming together. And so we're excited about that role again this year, Gemma.
Well, we always appreciate all the work that all of you do. A big thank you to Mia Maldonado, Clark Corbin, and Kyle Fonensteel, all with the Idaho Capital Sun, for our Friday Reporter Roundtable. Thanks so much for listening to Idaho Matters. Boise State Public Radio and Idaho Matters are members of the NPR network. It's an independent coalition of public media podcasters. You can find more shows in the network wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Gemma Gaudette. We'll see you tomorrow.
No matter what happens in Washington, the NPR Politics Podcast is here for you. For the latest news, insights, and analysis from the election and beyond, listen to the NPR Politics Podcast.